come back to Merrick, and I want to go back to Alex's point about these weird fear rituals and the violence and elections. And the reason I thought it was important to have this conversation with you is I've been thinking about why it's in the mainstream world so taboo for what Alex Jones did with Sandy Hook, even though I don't think he did much, honestly. He just questioned on it. He questioned it, right? But like in terms of him and Sandy Hook. And I'm like, there is a fear in me that false flags still happen and will happen and perhaps could happen the closer we get to an election, because it's so inflamed right now. Everyone is so upset with each other. There's no reality anymore. There has been like, I'm going to say there has been January 6th, and I don't mean that as like there's been an insurrection. I mean, in people's minds, there was an idea of an insurrection that they then try to sell through the media. Also, you talked about Whitmer at the very beginning, which for those who don't know, we had feds literally attempting to kidnap a governor during lockdowns. There was like 13 feds and maybe 2 or 3, maybe 4 guys who weren't feds. So that's all kind of like this conversation. And I'm like, are they making an example out of Alex because they want to make sure no one questions anything? And I'm not saying everything that happens is the government. It shouldn't be your one boogeyman, but damn, it's a lot of the times. And how many times, like 30 years later, do we learn about all these other weird things that happen behind the scenes that were like the government, like Gladio, that was happening for decades, and we only found out in the 90s. MK Ultra started in the 40s, late 40s, early 50s. We didn't find out about that till the 70s. So I don't want to tell people, hey, just question everything that happens, because it could be the government connected. Like people might remember maybe earlier this year or end of last year that young man who supposedly severed his father's head and then live streamed it, right, showed the head to the camera, and called on people to then do the same to other federal agents. His dad was supposedly a federal agent. And within, immediately after that happened, people are like, that wasn't even a real head. Other people are like, that was a fed. Other people, that's a false flag. Other people are like, that's real, because they're buying into a certain caricature that the mainstream portrays. And any of those could be possible. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I'm just saying you got to be, it might feel uncomfortable, but I do believe you got to have to kind of think of all those options as we go closer to this election, because it's going to get perhaps crazy. So that's why I think it's important to have this conversation. It's been memory hold. I don't really know why either, but it floods me with so many memories of the fear ritual as I experienced it as a 10-year-old. We were constantly, it was before, like the same way they did with the Twin Towers, and everyone's like, they rolled a TV into my classroom to make sure we all saw it, right? And I get it. It's like, they're like, oh, this is history. But it's also pretty ghoulish for a bunch of 15-year-olds in classrooms across America, or however old you were. I was 15 or 16 at the time, to have to watch this, And then I had these conversations with a lot of people who are older. I love to ask them, where were you when you found out about the JFK assassination? Everyone's got it. And like the Oklahoma thing was like that for me for a bit. And then it kind of it died out, got memory hold fairly quickly. And then until the McVeigh execution, which I was talking about at the beginning. And like I said, it was weird how the news was reporting on it. That has nothing to do with really anything. That really just talks about the ghoulishness of the news and the appetite of the audience to want to know, no pun intended, to know what he's eating for his last meal. But that was June 2001. And then 9/11 happens, and then it's a whole other fear ritual. And we're just living in a system of fear rituals. So that's why I think it's important to talk about these things. And like I started off the show talking about Bertman's article. I'd like to hear from you, like how Yeakey kind of falls into it, because that story really is bothersome. So if you could give us a overview on Yeakey, how that fits into all this stuff, that'd be great.
Yeah, Yeakey. I mean, I do want to kind of start off real quick. Yeakey was probably the thing that really dragged me into this story. I saw originally, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the follow Jinx or @crackconnoisseur. He dropped an edit, is what they're called, on Twitter. And it was just a kind of 2-3 minute long video on Terrance Yeakey and kind of tying it into the Oklahoma City bombing. Okay. And that's kind of what tugged on my heartstrings too. Because I mean, it was just insane. You're just like, what? You're like, this is almost unbelievable. So then you dig into it, and I didn't really have any thoughts, particularly on the Oklahoma City bombing at that time. And I dug into it from there. Then once I learned about Yeakey and be like, oh geez, this is legit. That's when I started digging the Oklahoma City bombing. So that's what the angle that tied me into it. I think it's different strokes for different folks. I know a lot of people like to say like John Doe 2. That's what really sucks them into that. yeah, the multiple, not just Terry, but Terry's probably the most sympathetic of them. The most, if you want to play that game. So if you want to present to an audience, he's probably the most sympathetic of the group in the sense that kind of tugs at your heartstrings. Because I mean, he was a cop. Was kind of a big old teddy bear, probably like well over 6 foot tall black dude. He had a wife. He had 2 kids, 2 really young kids. And it looks like he was trying to do the right thing and paid the price for it. But yeah, he was one of the first responders, which you already said earlier. But he he was there within minutes. I mean, from basically everywhere I've seen, it says he was pretty much the first. I usually am a little hesitant to say the first because it's a little bit harder to prove, but he was one of, if not the first individual who showed up. There within minutes. He had been responding to a call that was nearby. But yeah, he ended up saving over 3 lives. 3's way on the low end. I think Tanya claimed it was 8 or more. But then he, his life saving kind of came to an end. He fell 2 floors while he was saving people, and ended up injuring himself. Tanya is the one who picked him up from the hospital. They had been going through some issues at the time. About roughly a year, about a year and a half prior, I believe, to the bombing, she had filed what's it called, a VPO, essentially kind of like a restraining order. And they had some issues in their marriage at that time, but they had kind of come a long way since then, especially after the bombing. They came way closer, but that ended up being something that was used later that'll come back. But yeah, when she picked him up, probably one of the most famous quotes in relation to that is, "Tanya, it's not what they're saying is, they're not telling the truth." And according to her, he was like crying at the time, not like bawling or anything, but kind of man tears, So that was after getting picked up from the hospital. There also were like claims too that he was essentially being harassed at the hospital. Yeah, and then it comes about a year or so later, he was found in a field near El Reno. Wrists and throat were cut repeatedly, grass dirt in the wounds, rope burns / cuff bruises on feet and wrists, and a bullet had gone through his head. I believe it was from the right side going down at about an angle like this. So it's kind of like an awkward angle to shoot at.
It's a weird angle.
So yeah, so odd angle to shoot at. But as I said, he was actually, I don't think I'd said it yet, but his car was about 1.5 miles away from where his body was found. And his car was covered in about 2+ liters of blood, is kind of the estimate, which for those who have an understanding of the human body, I think it's like 3, I want to say, is where you're like definitely going to die. I think you can die at 2, but it's like you're just having severe blood loss at that point.
It's a lot.
You're not doing a whole lot.
Right.
Yeah, you're pretty out of it at that point. And he also had sickle cell anemia, so that factors in. So yeah, he was not. The idea of him getting from his car to the place where his body was found is a bit incredulous. So and especially because where his car was parked. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to say he was suspicious of things, right? After
yes. Yep.
How soon after the bombing was he suspicious? Was it immediately? Because I think I even read it. He was interested in like why the feds were there so quickly or something. Although I think that kind of makes sense because it was a federal building. But
well, with the context that he was the first or one of the first within minutes. The idea, I mean, obviously he's not here, so he can't tell us how quickly.
Right.
But like if there are feds there almost the same time as him or very shortly after, when you just got there and it just happened, I could see how he'd be like,
they knew something was coming, perhaps.
Yeah. By the way, what you're referencing is his letter to Ramona McDonald, which I'd highly recommend people go check that out. That's the best place to find. That's the Hoffman article, which you can find at libertarianinstitute.org/OKC, where the archive's at. But yeah, that was the McDonald letter. That was probably one of the more damning things in that letter. He basically claims that he was of the opinion it was a sting gone wrong. From my talk with Tanya, and it's kind of alluded to in the letter, but it was never very clear to me. But after talking to Tanya and after interviewing her, being a little bit more clear, seems to be there's an infamous elevator story, which I don't know if we got into this during it, but the ATF was not there for some reason. And there was a kind of a whole rigmarole of stories of reasons why they weren't there, or maybe that they actually were there that happened after the fact. One of which was this cockamamie, elevator story, which Lucas Franey, and I believe maybe it was another individual, essentially fell something like 5+ floors or something insane in an elevator, broke their way out of the elevator shaft, started saving lives, all sorts of craziness, like just nonsense superhero movie stuff. Later, the elevator repairman guy or one of the people looked into it after, and they're like, no, that didn't happen. Like, they're able to look at it. There's also sensors that, like, when that happens, like, and there's also backup so that doesn't happen. So they're like, yeah, that didn't happen. That was nonsense. But Lucas Franey, the individual, apparently, I mean, from what I recall, he kind of got into it with Yeakey got into it with him, I believe, because I'm assuming these sorts of claims and things along those lines. I think he also got into it. Dr. Chumley, which is another individual who died. His plane crashed, and he was another individual that kind of had questions as well. There's not as much. That's another one where I feel like there could be more research out there. I haven't seen a whole lot of research on him, but yeah, his plane went down, which is
Wow.
it's always planes, heart attacks, suicides.
I'm not crazy for thinking that this is, or for remembering the fact that all the officers who supposedly killed themselves after January 6th, just kind of sounds familiar. A lot of people, a lot of people like to say that these officers died on January 6th, but they in fact did not. Yes. They died at home or other places by their own hand, or I think a heart attack was one of them. But still, that was all beyond the fact. So, with Yeakey, was he like actually actively investigating? Like,
that is the claims. Obviously, like finding an official, but there are multiple people who claim to that being the case. Ramona McDonald being one of them. Tanya made claims that, although he never really divulged much to Tanya, but he did heavily allude to, multiple statements along those lines while being insanely vague. Clearly seems to be he was not trying to tell her. He was trying to keep her safe. Another key part of the story that I haven't brought up is that he was trying to remarry Tanya. He had asked her to. He was, from a position of him being scared something was going to happen. He was also trying to get her to sign life insurance papers at the time, which I guess some people could say, oh, that was suicide, but you don't get that for suicide usually in most cases.
Right.
So that's something to be, noted. So that's where they were at in the relationship at the time. They had been together a lot because people point to the issues they had previous in their marriage usually, and as an example of why he may have killed himself. Although, just looking at the scene of the crime, I feel like leads you to think, yeah, that's that's not very likely. But like, for example, no autopsy was performed, no suicide note. We never, if there were ballistics, we'll never know because we never received. It's not like there was ever shown any. Right. So I believe it was just an autopsy, not an autopsy report, but a coroner's report that we got is all that we got. There was supposedly another one that showed up later that got quickly redacted, so there's no copies of that, but that's kind of the lore. There was another one that came out later.